All right, please open up your Bibles to John chapter 12. John chapter 12. John chapter 12. Oops. All right, there we go. So, I thought that was mine. When we look at the world, and we specifically look at places like regions in South America, Africa, places in China, but even in our own country, we see a lot of bad stuff. There's a picture that I really want to show you, but I just don't know if I should, of what is really going on in the world around us. I'll describe the picture to you, though, instead of showing it to you. It's a picture of a little boy, just several years old, and you can see his ribs. He's bent over. He's obviously starving, and behind him, in the background, you have a vulture that's just looking on. Have y'all seen that image before? Yeah. It's one of the Time magazine top 100 images of all time. The person who took that image ended up taking their own life a year later because of all of the destitution and just horrible conditions that they had to witness. And that forces us to ask a very difficult question. And that question is that the way that things have to be? Is that the way that things have to be? Do there have to be always people that are doomed to suffer like that person in the photo? Now, that child didn't die the day that the man took the photo. He actually died 14 years later because of malaria. Still an awful situation. But is that the way that the world has to be? Is that what we're just destined for forever and ever and ever until the end of time? Well, a lot of people think like that. A lot of people think that is how it has to be, because whenever we talk about what would happen if every single person accepted the gospel, or even if a majority, or even if half of the people in the world accepted the gospel, what would the world look like? There's always somebody that speaks up and says, well, Daniel, the poor will always be with you. See, because whenever we talk about loving your neighbor as yourself, and we're going to look at some passages today from the book of Luke about being willing to lend and to offer a helping hand, and the Good Samaritan, picking somebody up out of the ditch. If even just half of the people in the world adopted those principles of loving your neighbors and loving your enemies, what kind of world would we live in? Would there be people like the child pictured in the photo? I don't think so. But when you bring that up, somebody invariably quotes Jesus from John chapter 12 and says, well, the poor will always be with you, which means that it's unrealistic to hope for a time in which people don't go without. But I think that takes Jesus' statement out of context, and I'd really like to help us this morning see what the context of Jesus' statement is, not only in its original setting, but also the Old Testament background behind what Jesus said. Because what a lot of people don't realize is Jesus' comment, the poor will always be with you, is actually a quotation from the book of Deuteronomy. So we'll look more into what that means here in just a minute. First, let's look at John chapter 12 and get the context. He says, Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was intending to betray him, said, why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people? Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief, and he had the money box. Pilfer. I can't say the word. Pilfer what was put into it. Thank you. going crazy there. Okay, let's talk about 300 denarii for a second, because that's kind of a funny word. Sounds like maybe what somebody would wear, would wear to, what's that? I just forgot what it's called. Somebody might think it's like a sari, what they wear to, what's it called? Indian culture, they celebrate it once a year. The what? Denali? Is that? I don't know what it's called. It's on the tip of my tongue. It starts with a D. But regardless, it sounds like some kind of garment that somebody would wear. 300 denarii, what's that? So denarii is a day's wages. Let's just say, since Florida passed for the minimum wage to go to $15 here in the last election, let's say somebody was paid $15 a week, 40 hours a week, times 52, that's about $31,200 a year. Okay, but let's do this. Let's do $15 times 8 hours times, times 300 days. That's $36,000. All right. So Judas looks at this perfume and he's like, man, that could be sold for $36,000 in today's money. All right. And what he says is, we could have taken this money, sold it for $36,000, and given to the poor. Now that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But the thing about Judas is he was pilfering. He was he used to pilfer what was put into the money box, right? In other words, he was skimming off the top. So as soon as he walks into the house, he looks over to the mantle, and he's going, hey, there's that jar of perfume. That thing could go for 300 days' wages, couldn't it? And then to his surprise and shock, Martha takes that and pours it all over Jesus. And he's going, oh, man, you got to be kidding me. He maybe could have even, snuck it into his bag on the way out, right? But he's saying, we could have taken that, sold it for 300 days' wages and given to the poor. What was the problem there, though? The problem was he wanted to take the money for himself, is really what it was all about. He had no intentions of giving it to the poor, or maybe like Ananias and Sapphira, giving a portion of it and saying, here it is, here's what we got, but really keeping the bulk of it to himself. And so here's what Jesus says to this in verse 7. He says, let her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. Now, we'll talk about that here in a moment. So whenever Jesus says this, think about it. This perfume has filled all the house. It's gone into every room. And they're sitting there trying to eat, and they're having to deal with all this perfume. I don't know about you, but whenever Laura goes into Bath and Body Works, I just can't stand it. You walk in there, you just get blasted by all these smells, autumn and fall and winter and cinnamon and all this sort of stuff. It's the worst. Get your allergies going, you start coughing. So what I do is I go to try to find one of those booths where it has those old video games, and you sit there and play them while the women go and shop, or something like that. Or go down and find one of those massage chairs and sit there for a bit. So this is what Judas is doing, though. He's sitting there in the house, the perfume's going all over, and every whiff that he takes, he's thinking, man, I could have had that for myself. So it's killing him. It's eating him up. Her goodness is being compared with his evil, and whenever that's done, the person just goes into great despair. This is why Jesus said that people who are evil can't stand the light, because it exposes their deeds of darkness, right, in John chapter 3. So here Judas is just beside himself, and Jesus says, you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. Now people take a look at that statement in verse 8, and they make it a universal truth. In other words, there's always going to be poor people. But really what it was a jab at Judas. What he was really saying is, you've had plenty of time to care for the poor, and others have had plenty of time to care for the poor, and you're going to have more time to care for the poor, but you are, being more greedy. See, and Jesus knew all that was going on, right? He knew Judas's heart and what Judas's intentions really were. So first and foremost, this comment here is not a universal statement about the poor, but is a jab at Judas. But then whenever we look into the Old Testament context, what we see is it's not a universal statement about the poor at all. What it really is a challenge to his disciples and to us to care for the poor whenever that sort of situation may come up. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 15. Deuteronomy chapter 15. Can't spell. Deuteronomy chapter 15 and verse 1. So what we have to talk about first is this thing called the sabbatic year, the seventh year. He says, at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a remission of debts. All right? This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brothers, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. From a foreigner you may exact it, but your hand shall release whatever of yours is with your brother. So, if they were to give out a loan, after 7 years, they forgive it. Doesn't matter how much was paid, doesn't matter how little was paid, they forgive the loan. Now, this kind of seems shocking to us because we live in a culture that is perpetually in debt. From your mortgage to your student loans, to credit cards, to vehicle loans. We're just so accustomed to being in debt that the idea of forgiveness of debt seems almost un-American. I'll just let that one sit for a second. So here in Deuteronomy chapter 15, they have debt forgiveness every 7 years. Why is this? This is not for the rich or whatever. This is for the people specifically that were poor, so that they would not be taken advantage of. In fact, you know this as well, they weren't even supposed to charge interest rates to their neighbors in Israel. They weren't even to make a profit off what they loaned out. It was to be completely and totally out of the goodness of their heart. Why? Because nothing in that land belonged to them at all. Even though it was technically theirs, even though it was in their house and belonged to them and they could make payments with it, where did it all come from? It all came as a gift from God, because this is the promised land that they're living in, right? This is the land flowing with milk and honey. This is the land where God told Abraham his descendants would live forever and ever and ever if they kept his covenant. And so anything that they gave really wasn't them giving it. It was the Lord giving it. And they weren't to take advantage of these individuals, right? So let's look down to verse 11, because this is where Jesus quotes from. He says, "For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land." You see, this statement is a challenge to them, that whenever a situation comes up where someone becomes poor or destitute or lacks daily bread, they're supposed to jump to it, open up their hands, not harden their hearts, and freely give to their brother. Because here's why. If there's a situation in the promised land, in the land flowing with milk and honey, that is abundance and wealth and plenty for everyone, if someone goes to bed at night hungry, then something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. If someone goes to bed at night hungry, that means that someone somewhere is not doing their part in opening up their hand to freely give. You see? So Deuteronomy 15:11 is a challenge to them to take care of these poor whenever someone comes into a circumstance where they are poor. Now go back to verse 4 and notice what he says in Deuteronomy 15 and verse 4. "However, there will be no poor among you, since the Lord will surely bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess." In other words, if there's somebody that's poor in the land, it's because someone somewhere else is holding it up. Someone's tearing down their barns to build bigger barns. Someone is eating big banquets while their neighbor down the street is starving. Somebody's messed something up. Somebody's not loving their neighbor as themselves. So this statement that he makes about the poor always being in the land isn't a universal truth. It's what happens when things go wrong. It's what happens whenever people harden their hearts and close their hands and shut out those who are in need. If there's poor in a place, it's because someone who has is not being as generous to others as God has been generous to him. And the land flowing with milk and honey, if someone goes without, it's because something has gone wrong. Someone is stopping this process of giving and receiving, right? Now, let's look back at verse 4 again. Notice, this might be the case in your Bible. Notice in my Bible, it's capital L-O-R-D. Capital L-O-R-D. This is This is basically a callback to Exodus chapter 3. Okay, let me show you what I mean. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 16, God reveals his name to Moses. In Exodus 3 and 13, he says, then Moses says to God, behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? Look down to verse 16. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, capital L-O-R-D, the God of your fathers and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So he says that they are to go and that he is to go and to give them this name, L-O-R-D. Look what he says in verse 15. This is what I meant to go to. I had the wrong verse down in my notes. He says, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, there it is, L-O-R-D, capital letters, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. Memorial name, what does that mean? That means whenever they call upon this specific name, it is a reminder to them where they came from. And where did they came from? From the land of Egypt, where they didn't have, where they were oppressed, where they were poor, where they were strangers in a foreign land. And so whenever Moses calls upon this name throughout his scripture to tell the people what to do, he uses this name as a reminder for them where they came from and how they need to treat people just as God has treated them, right? To treat others with compassion and mercy and grace, and to give to those who don't have, and to treat the foreigner with kindness because you were once strangers in a foreign land, and all these sorts of things, right? This is a memorial name for them. For example, look at Leviticus chapter 25. Notice the repetition here. He says in Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 17, for instance, you shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. God hasn't wronged you, so you don't wrong them. God brought you out of the land of Egypt, so you don't wrong others. He says in verse 38 of this same chapter here, he says, notice what the context is, by the way. Now in the case of a countryman of yours becomes poor, and his means with regards to you falter, then you are to sustain him. That's why there's not to be any poor. You're to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Do not take a usurious interest from him, but revere your God, that your countrymen may live with you. You shall not give him your silver at interest, nor your food for gain. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you, notice that, to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If any of them became poor, they were to take them up, to sustain them, and to make it so it wasn't that way. If someone becomes poor then and doesn't have and goes to sleep without proper clothing, without proper food, in the street, whatever, it's because someone somewhere else is holding it up. Someone has broken the chain of giving and receiving that Jesus established, or rather that God established in the Exodus. The land was a gift, so they weren't supposed to treat it as if it belonged to them at all, right? If we change how we view possessions, okay, if we look at all of what we have as a gift to God, as a gift from God, then we understand that we can give to others and will be freely given in return. We give knowing that God sustains the birds of the air and the flower in the field. If God clothes the lily, as Jesus said, and if God feeds the bird, how much more will he take care of us who trust in him? And so he says here in Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 35 through 38 that they were to care for those because I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God. This is a reminder of where they came from. They came from the land of Egypt, so they needed to treat others with grace and mercy as well. So let's go to Deuteronomy 15 again. Look at verses 7 and 8. Notice what he says here. If there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers in any town, in any of your towns in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Why would they do that? So that there wouldn't be any poor. So the statement that Jesus makes, the poor will always be with you, comes from a context talking about how to deal with the poor. Make it so that there aren't any. It's a challenge, not just a universal truth that should cause us to throw our hands in the air and give up on the idea that there could possibly be a time when no one would have to go without. Because when you look at the world that God has made, is the world that God made insufficient to provide us with our every need? Did God make a world that was so unfair? Did God make a world that was so just poor itself that it can't richly give to all? Why don't farmers today leave the corners of their fields? Why do we use these machines to make sure that every single piece of fruit comes off and not a single one is left for the poor? Why do we live like that? Because we've forgotten where we came from. We've forgotten that everything that we have is a gift from God. Now, that doesn't mean that some people will be richer than other people. Some people live in nicer houses. Some people will live and have nicer cars. Some people will have better food. Some people will be eating great steaks while others will be eating, spam or whatever. But it doesn't mean that people have to go without. It doesn't mean that there has to, we don't have to live in a world where that kid in that picture I told you about a while ago even has to exist. But people look at Jesus' comments there as an excuse to not do anything, not as an opportunity to do all we can. That's where everything is falling apart. Let's look at some passages here in the Old Testament. In Job chapter 24, and you can follow along up here, you can read in your Bible as well, but I'm going to try to go through these kind of quickly. In Job 24 and verse 10, he says, "They cause the poor to go about naked without clothing, and they take away the sheaves from the hungry." Notice what he says. They cause the poor to go naked. That's kind of the opposite of our view towards people that are poor. We don't look at the rich as having caused them to go that way. We look at them as having ended up that way themselves. But nowhere in Leviticus or in these passages that we're about to read does it put the blame on the one who is poor. It puts the blame on the one who is overly rich and holding back what was a gift to them that they should be giving as a gift to others. You see, the blame isn't put on the poor. The blame is always put on those who were rich, who were holding back giving gifts as they had been given. You see? Let's look at Jeremiah chapter 22 and verse 13. In Jeremiah 22:13, the prophets here call out as well. He says, up. Put a space there. 22:13. "Woe to him who builds his house without righteousness and his upper rooms without justice, who uses his neighbor's services without pay and does not give him his wages." He goes on to say that they weren't going to live in the houses like that they built. He says in verses 16 and 17, "He pled the cause of the afflicted and needy, then it was well. Is not that what it means to know me, declares the Lord?" In other words, if you plead the cause of the afflicted and the needy, he says that's what it means to know the Lord, right? If you're doing that, if you're caring for the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, James chapter 1 says that's pure religion, right? And so this is what the prophets did, and this is what we should do as well. Verse 17 says, "But your eyes and your heart are intent only upon your own dishonest gain, and on shedding innocent blood, and on practicing oppression and extortion." Things like that go in the world today? Sure. What's our duty as Christians? To follow the example of the prophets and to call those people out. That's what we have to do. That's what they did. Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 49. Now, people loved going to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah to talk about sins that they don't have to deal with, or talk about things that they don't have to deal with personally, even though that's not really what the story is about. Look at Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 49. He says, "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance abundant food, and careless ease. But she did not help the poor and the needy. What happened to Sodom? Got burned down, right? Why? What was her sin? Because she had abundant food, careless ease, but she didn't help the poor and the needy. Look around at the world today. Do we have situations like that? Sodom wasn't a country that was God's chosen people, right? And yet God judged them because they weren't willing to take care of the poor and the needy. Let's look at Malachi chapter 3, verse 5. This will be the last one that we look at. It's all over the place. You can find these passages in the prophets. He says, "Then I will draw near to you for judgment, and I'll be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, and against those who oppress the wage earner in his wages, the widow and the orphan, and those who turn aside the alien," that is the foreigner, "and to do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts." Who is it that Malachi said would be judged? Yeah, we all like to talk about adulterers, right? People like to talk about those who steal, or people like to talk about those who lie. But when we start talking about those who oppress the wage earners, when we start talking about those who oppress the widow and the orphan, those who turn aside the alien, all of a sudden, don't bring politics into it. It's not political. It's our call from God to take care of those who are in need. Okay, let's switch gears for a second. Notice how the early church dealt with some of these problems. Go to Acts chapter 2. Let's go to Acts chapter 2, verse 44 and 45. Notice what he says. He says, "All those who had believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, as anyone might have need." What happened in Acts 2? All these people obeyed the gospel. Suddenly now they're losing their friends, they're losing their family, they're being kicked out of their houses, they might even be losing their places of employment. So what do? They rally together and take care of these 3,000 that were in need. Now, what happens after this? Go to Acts chapter 4, verse 32 to 37. Notice what comes next. So you have 2,000 more people that were added to their number. So now the number is 5,000 people in Jerusalem. Well, at this point, you all know how the story went. At this point, the disciples looked around at these 2,000 extra people and they said, "Oh, well, the poor will always be with you. Oh, well, too bad. Guess we'll have to go with that. We've already done all this for these others." That's not what they did at all. Look what happens. The congregation of those who believe were of one heart and soul. Now, we think those who are one heart and soul mean they agree with all the doctrine. That's not what the passage is talking about. When it's talking about people being of one heart and one soul, of one mind, it's not saying that they'll have to believe on every little doctrinal point. If that were the case, who would be saved? Because nobody has perfect knowledge. Some people say, does that mean that you fellowship people who are in error? Well, I don't fellowship anybody except for people who are in error. Because who has it all figured out and who has it all right? To say that I've got everything right is to say that I'm omniscient just like God is. He says here they were of one heart and one soul. And not one of them claimed that anything belonging to him was his own. That's what I mean. We have to rethink how we view possessions. We've become a very materialistic-minded world. He says, "But all things were common property to them. And with great power the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And abundant grace was upon them all. For there was not a needy person among them." Wait a minute, I thought the poor will always be with you. What happened to that? See, that's not how it has to be. Now, as long as you're skimming off the top, like Judas was, oh yeah, the poor will always be with you. But whenever you open your hand and are kind and are generous and are gracious, as God was gracious to you, then this is a situation that can come about. "There was not a needy person among them, for all who are owners of land or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as any had need." That's the situation that we could be living in if people accepted the gospel. Within the covenant community, there's no reason for anyone to have any need. Now, this is a reference to Deuteronomy here. If you look there was not a needy person among them. That's a callback to what we read in Deuteronomy 15, the very start of that passage, where it says there will be no poor among you. Because in the land flowing with milk and honey, if somebody's going without, something's gone wrong. And we talk about how great the country is, how we're the richest country in the world. And yet we have the most of our populations in prisons. We got people that are going without. We have veterans who proudly and bravely serve our country to fight for these freedoms that go homeless, have PTSD and depression and anxiety and all these things that they've been afflicted with, and we're not even helping them. What's happened? What's going on? That was the sin of Sodom, and look what happened to them. Might need to be careful. We like to focus on sins that we don't have to deal with. We love talking about sexual sins. We love talking about things that are easy to point out, abortion, stuff like that. But we don't like talking about the root of all evil, which is the love of money. That's the cause of all those problems, you see. And this is what the prophets focused on, and it's what we should focus on as well. Let's go to Luke chapter 6, verse 30 through 36. While I'm flipping over there, you know how we read that passage in the Old Testament about how every 7 years they would forgive debts? You know, in the Lord's Prayer, it says, forgive our transgressions as we forgive those who transgresseth against us. You know that in some versions it says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. You know that the original translators of the Bible to English translated it transgressions because they were afraid Christians might start forgiving debts and calling on people to forgive debts. Well, you know, that's what they did in Leviticus. But let's move on. Okay. He says, give to everyone who asks of you. Whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. Treat others the same way you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. But love your enemies, and do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you'll be sons of the Most High. For he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Well, that's a challenging passage, huh? Who can do that? That's difficult to read, because that's not how we've been trained to think of our possessions. That's not how we've been trained to think of our wealth as a nation, as a state, as a city, as a congregation. But this is how God has called us to live. Because there doesn't have to be a situation like that little boy in the picture that I told you about but didn't show you. You should go look it up. But I just go look up little boy Africa vulture and it'll pop right up on your screen. Then you'll cut it off as soon as you see it because it's just so awful. But there doesn't have to be situations like that. People have abundant wealth. We have, people talk about if you have so and so many pairs of shoes, then you're wealthy compared to most of the world. So why do people have to go without? Why do people somewhere not get what they need? Because Christians throw their hands up in the air and say, well, the poor will always be with you, so it's just how it is, tough luck, not a fair world. But when God created the world, he said that it was good. And when God created Israel, he told them that they were to do certain things to ensure that those types of situations wouldn't arise. And besides, if you want to take that statement as a universal truth, the poor will always be with you, he doesn't say the destitute have to always be with you. Those who are just going completely without, right? Sure, somebody might not drive a Cadillac, but can they at least drive a beat-up Honda, whatever, a Civic or something like that, from 2001, Maybe one of the ways that we would see this taking place in our world is if people traded a used car drive instead of having one super nice car themselves. We might see people trading in their 10-bedroom mansions for a 3-bedroom house, with 2 bathrooms, in order that 5 other people could have the same sort of living arrangement. See, this is how the world would be if people would accept the gospel. Nobody would have to go without. Nobody would have to suffer and to be naked and to be hungry and to be sick. Think about this. If everybody accepted this, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, we wouldn't have debates about minimum wage. We'd have to have debates about maximum wage. Because old John, who owns a business over there, gave all the way he has and was going without food because he keeps paying his people too much, We wouldn't have debates about health care and should people have health care. Because if your neighbor got sick, what would you do? You'd bend over backwards, you and the entire community, to make sure that they got the care that they needed without any thought of cost or expense or anything like that. There wouldn't be any question. But the reason why there's a question is because something has gone terribly wrong. We've returned to Egypt. We've gone back, like what we talked about this morning, into these old ways of materialism and focus on earthly things instead of focusing on heavenly things. We put our faith in money and the love of money instead of putting our faith in God. And it's up to us to follow in the footsteps of the prophets, to follow in the footsteps of James and of Jesus and these others, and call out these systems that are not fair. Call out these systems that are ungodly and that put their love in money and serve that master, because that is the root of all evil. So, the poor will always be with you. What do we say to that? Bring it on. Bring it on. We'll see about that, right? That's what we should say. But it's going to take more people accepting that message in order to get that done. But we can start with us. We can start here. Instead of rolling up our window and kind of playing with our phone or adjusting the radio, we can give them a pack of sunflower seeds or a pack of peanuts. We don't have to switch lanes in order to miss the person who's sitting there, homeless fed or whatever. We see somebody that's out sitting in the cold on a bench, get them a cup of hot coffee. You don't have to tear off an arm, but you can do something. You have enough, right? Don't rent that movie from Redbox tonight. Get somebody a hot biscuit from McDonald's. Maybe we just need to rethink how we view things. It's not saying you should go without, not saying you should give up any luxury that you have, but it is saying that we should rethink how we view those around us as God's children. Because in Matthew 25, just to end it, when those people are gathered before Jesus to be judged, how does he judge them? Based on their doctrine, based on how much they study the Bible in the day, based on how good they are at singing, or if they know new songs versus old songs? No. What does he judge them by? You saw me sick, you saw me in prison, you saw me naked, you saw me hungry, and what'd you do? You helped me. That's what the word visit means. You visited me. That's ultimately what really matters. Because God loves and cares for everyone. We should do the same. We should do unto others as we would want them to do to us. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop there. And if you have any